Hello, my name is David Ralph, and I want to talk to you today about the Bristol Project, which is concerned with value in health systems and rethinking how that is done, how it's created, how we understand it, and using that as a way to think differently about how we allocate resource. And here's why I think it's important. Because at the moment there seems to be a lot of consensus about where we want to take our health system in the UK. More prevention, greater focus on creating environments that people be and stay healthy, but despite broad agreement on this sort of narrative, we find it very difficult to make any meaningful progress in, for example, a city like Bristol, where I live. Why is this? I think there are three issues. First of all, I think we lack a really well identified and legitimised forum for having this discussion about the real system stuff rather than just specifics of what organisations are doing. I think as well there's also a big behavioural challenge for all of us, and I think there's a gap at the moment between the language we use about system leadership and the way we actually behave in terms of how we allocate our time and our resources to system value rather than organisational value. And I think at the heart of this is a lack of understanding about what we mean by the term value. At the moment all of our understanding of value is implicit, unstated, and therefore never discussed, and I think we need to break it out. We need to discuss this more openly, because until we do, we're going to find it very difficult to think about new ways to allocate resource. Here's what I mean. Within a health system like Bristol, you can identify quite quickly how much organisations spend, because you know how much they receive from commissioners. Put this all together in the city, let's say we spend approximately £1.3 billion a year on healthcare in Bristol. My question is, do we spend this in the best way? I'm not sure at the moment we have a way to answer that question, and the reason is we don't have a shared theory of value. At the moment we have theories of value, but they're implicit. They're embedded within the way in which we allocate resource, and therefore they need to be inferred by interrogating the way in which we spend our money. And I would argue that our implicit and embedded theories of value are short-term, because we deal very typically in years 1 or 2, next couple of financial years, rather than decades, which is really what is the currency for creating system value in the longer term. We also deal very much in terms of activity rather than outcome, so we understand how much it costs, for example, to perform cardiac surgery, but we don't have a really clear sense about how it is that we need to allocate resource to improve the quality of someone's life with a long-term condition through life. And we also understand in terms of budgets, organisational budgets rather than system value. We understand very clearly what the organisational budgets look like. We don't really know whether we're spending this money in the best way. So this is what the Bristol Project is all about, trying to find a way to open up this discussion by talking about value and finding a way to develop an explicit and shared theory of value which will allow us to think again about how we allocate resource across whole systems. This is a pretty challenging proposition, and at the start of it I think it's really about finding new ways to think about how we understand value and looking for mechanisms that will help us to rethink the way in which we allocate resource. And here's one of them which I want to share. It's called a social impact fund. Let's say, for example, for every 100 people who leave prison, a certain proportion re-offend. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that number is 50%. We know for each of those individuals there will be an associated cost in terms of police, prison and court time, and we know that it will probably fall between years 0 and 10 for the sake of argument. So we know, all other things being equal, that for every 100 people who leave prison there's an associated cost to the system, and it looks like this. Now these will be in our budgets at the moment, so commissioners will have already allocated this money to be spent based on previous behaviour and how things work across the system. So what if we could design an intervention that would reduce that rate of reoffending by, say, half? Well, as a number of benefits, there's a pretty clear benefit to those individuals, to their families, to their communities and to society more generally, but it also has a financial benefit, because all of a sudden this is money we don't have to spend. Now conceptually this is quite challenging, because this is money in the future. These are organisational budgets typically in the sort of 5 to 10 year timescale. But if we can find a way to link this intervention to the creation of this value, this offset and unnecessary expenditure, then we can do something with it. And there are 3 things generally we can do with it. Number 1 is give it back to the system in some way, as a saving. Either saving or as a reallocation of resources to someone we think is going to be spent better. The next 2 ones really look at the sort of cost of the intervention. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that this is the overall cost of your intervention. Initial, subsequent, all the whole thing through life. We can use at least a part of this offset expenditure, this value we've created, to finance the initial intervention, typically years 1 to 2. But we need to find a lot more resource, say another additional 75%, to finance the rest of it. And this bit here isn't going to be enough on its own, so we need to do something clever with this. And this is where the bond bit comes in, because you use this money to offer a rate of interest to external investors. Say to people, if you want to help us with this intervention and it delivers this benefit by reducing the rate of your funding by half, then we will use this to pay you interest. And at the moment, the sort of numbers people are talking about are between 6 to 8% a year over about 5 to 10 years. Now, of course, there's all sorts of problems associated with it potentially. How do we link this intervention to this value? How do we create some sort of analytical rigor around this? And how do we get commissioners to buy into the notion that we can take money from their budgets in the next 5 years and spend it now on these things? Well, that's all challenging, but the basis of the methodology, I think, is really sound. And here is just one way in which we might be thinking about new ways to describe value in terms of health systems. So that's a specific example, but there's a more general aspect to what we're doing. Really, this, I guess, is what the Bristol Project is all about. There are various factors out there, which are things like cold, the cost and effects of cold in the winter, smoking, exclusion. All of these factors that will have an impact on people's lives will be manifested across the system in some way. They are manifested in various ways, both as for example, reduced life chances, inequality, or illness. And typically in the health system, this is what we focus on. We think about illness. But what maybe we should be thinking about is broader ways to address the impact of all these factors. And that, I think, is a way to describe and to think about how value is created in the longer term, in a different way. And then the question is, well, how do you understand the potential impact of all these factors? So you might argue that actually the impact of cold is pretty big, or the smoking is small, or whatever. But finding some way to describe the different costs or impacts of these factors is really important, because that will underpin the way you think about value, because you'll then say, well, actually, if this is a huge amount of impact, we should probably be allocating a bit more resource to solving this problem. And focusing, I guess, on the broader manifestation rather than just a specific manifestation, which is illness, which is where we focus right now. And then the question is, well, how do we design mechanisms that allow us to address these impacts? You know, one of them is a social impact bond, but it might not be the only one. There might be other methodologies out there which are different ways to think about value and how we allocate our resources to try and alleviate the impact of these broader factors. So that's it in a nutshell, really. Different ways to think about value, experimenting with things like social impact bonds, in order to be able to answer this key question: are we spending our money, are we allocating our resources in the best way across the whole of our system? At the moment, I don't think we know. So that's what the Bristol Project is all about. If you'd like to join in, then you can get in touch with me, dcjralph@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.